There we go. Our fifth class of Bunsen Burners, Beakers, and Bibles, the intersection of science and faith. Welcome back. Good to have you with us. There we go. Whoops. I thought I was on the first slide and I was on the last slide. So let's start from the beginning. Okay. In our very first class, just a quick review, very first class, we looked at the first key idea I wanted to bring to this class, that is God's two books. Here's the quote from Francis Bacon. And we talked about how the metaphor of God's two books has a long history of in Christian belief, and how I believe it's foundational when we arrive at the intersection of faith and science. Now, the second key idea I finally got to last week. It actually took 3 sessions to get there, but I included with these ideas that modern science is a legacy of Christianity. I still love that quote. Because these 3 novel ideas below, grounded in Christian belief and thought, emerged as widely held convictions in 17th century Europe. And last week, we took time to talk about each of these 3. The physical realm is regular, predictable, and law-abiding. The laws of nature are accessible to and knowable by humans. And finally, science must rely on observation, measurements, and experiments, also known as empirical methods. So here's the list of our 8 topics. And in yellow, we've finished these 4. And tonight we're going to cover 2 topics. We're going to talk about science and faith 3 ways, and then we're going to go on and do the section about 4 beliefs about origins. So we're going to move along pretty quickly tonight. I will also tell you that next week I will be covering topics 7 and 8. So again, next week will be a 2-for-1, and that will be the last of our regular classes. Now, I spoke with the Sunday night in-person class just yesterday and offered to them to do a special bonus session 2 weeks from now, and that would be here at our house. So Ellen and I are going to invite everybody over, and apologies to our out-of-state friends, but for those of you in-state, of course, Dan, you're always willing, if you're always welcome to fly in and join us 2 weeks. But Connie and Steve and Dave, if perchance you would like to be down here on Sunday night in 2 weeks, we're going to do an extra bonus section, and we'll have some food and just kind of wrap up this in this class. So I wanted to let everybody know about that ahead of time. So tonight, science and faith 3 ways. Let me go get that screen, and we'll get started on tonight's topics. Right there it is. That's the one I need. Okay. Science and faith 3 ways. And this section of the class is going to talk broadly about us as Americans, not necessarily Christians or the church. This is about us as Americans and how the American public, the whole nation, thinks about the intersection of science and faith. And I'll start with this survey results from the Pew Research Center. You probably have heard that name before. Back in 2015, Pew Research did a nationwide survey. Generally, do you think science and religious are often in conflict? 59%. Mostly compatible? 36%. 5% don't know. So this is pretty striking. Almost 60% of the American public views it as being um, conflicting forms of human thought, and only just over a third of Americans in this survey responded in the sense that it might be a peaceful, harmonious relationship. These numbers are reflected in a second survey done by Gallup poll in 2005. And I like this poll because they asked a different question and they offered 3 responses. So the question was, which comes closer to your view about the relationship between science and religion? First option was generally conflict with each other. The second option was not related in any meaningful way. That's interesting. And the third option, generally agree with each other. So these surveys asked the question differently. They got different answers. But what's similar is that it's a striking minority of Americans who find science and faith compatible, in agreement. And we have a strong majority of folks who either think it's in conflict or not meaningfully related. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. I like these 3 categories used in the Gallup poll, and I think these are useful for us as we think about faith and science, because for those who think about faith and science in conflict, especially for those who are religious, conflict can create dissonance and distraction. Conflict can create fear, especially for Christians, fear that, well, maybe what I believe isn't true, maybe the Bible isn't true, maybe God doesn't exist. And dissonance and fear sap emotional energy and mental energy. So in my view, conflict can be pretty damaging to how we live. When I hear this description, unrelated, that makes me think of a life in which our thinking is divided or compartmentalized. And I'm going to open up that idea here in a couple slides and talk about it further. It might be a more peaceful way to live in conflict, but it's still not, it's not whole and it's integrated. And I think there's lots of opportunity for us to arrive at a complementary, harmonious view of science faith, where our thinking, our life is integrated and whole. And I believe that draws us to wonder and worship. And I hope that can happen for each of us. Well, what's notable here, whichever of these surveys we look at, let's not quibble over the numbers. There's a pretty striking majority of Americans in these categories that view science and faith as outright conflict, or at least unrelated to one another. And it's only a minority of Americans who find this complementary approach. So let's start by talking about this idea of conflict. And I want to ask the idea, is it damaging? And for us Christians, I really think it is. So here's a third survey, this one done by the Barna Group. Now, you may or may not have heard of this group. They are, in fact, a social sciences company, much like Pew Research, like Gallup, but they focus their surveys on the church and Christianity in America. And their surveys are almost always topics to do with the church. That's their specialty. And in fact, they conducted a national public opinion, actually a series of national public opinion surveys between 2007 and 2011, 5-year period. And over that time, they had interviews with 1,300 young adults, 18 to 29-year-olds, individuals who had previously been active in a Christian church at some point in their teens. So basically, they're talking to young adults, people who had been churched, and they wanted to find out, where are you now? And what Barna found out is that 3 out of every 5 young Christians, almost 60%, disconnect from church life, either permanently or for an extended time after age 15. And frankly, that's a pretty sobering number, that a lot of teenage churchgoers are having serious disconnects from the church as young adults. Now, as part of the Barna Group survey, they explored why, and there was no single reason. As we might expect, people take many different journeys in their life of faith, but there were 6 themes that were pretty common and repeated among the interviewees. And the only one I'm going to look at was reason number 3. Churches come across as antagonistic to science. Of the 6 reasons given in this survey, or uncovered in this survey, this is the one that really has to do with faith and science. And the sample comments from those who were interviewed were things like, Christians are too confident, they know all the answers. Churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. People said Christianity is anti-scientific. Some were turned off by the creation versus evolution debate. Just got tiresome. And some reported a struggle to stay faithful to their beliefs and be faithful to their professions in science-related industries. Well, all these things point to the difficulties that many young adults have experienced because of encountering atmospheres of conflict, attitudes of conflict between science and faith. So that was a quick look at the conflict idea and how it can be damaging in the Christian context. I next want to talk a little about this idea of science and faith being unrelated, that life, we can take on divided ways of thinking, and our thinking becomes compartmentalized. And the way I've come to think about that, this divided thinking, I'm going to go with this idea of an upper story, lower story, where in our lives we can easily have some parts of our life we keep upstairs, and when we're up there, everything's fine and it works. And we can keep some parts of our life downstairs, lower story, and everything is peaceful and everything works there. But the parts of our lives that live on these 2 stories are compartmentalized, and they don't really relate to each other. Life can be peaceful this way, but it's kind of divided. So pretty common, I believe, in American culture today is an upper story, lower story, much like I'm describing here, where metaphysical, religious, spiritual topics like morality, values, the meaning of life, our religious commitments are in the upper story. And this is a story where knowledge is relative. We can't be certain. We live by faith. And knowledge can be relative to the age in which we live, to the culture in which we live, or even to the individual choices of each person. So putting all these things in an upper story can really allow us to live pretty peacefully with a lower story where we have other dimensions of our lives, the physical realm, the laws of nature, science, parts of life where knowledge is highly certain because we have measurements, we have experiments, we have data, and things are pretty clear, and there are widely held consensus about what's real, what's true. So in my view, a lot of Americans live with a divided way of thinking, somewhat like shown on this slide. Each story has a life of its own, independent of the other, and it can be a pretty peaceful existence. In my view, I think Christians of all people have the opportunity where our thinking and our lives can be integrated and whole, much more like this, where we can find faith, morality, values, meaning of life, physical realm, laws of nature, science. These things can all become integrated in a whole, because as the quote I've already used, all truth is God's truth. I think this is a unique opportunity for Christians to engage in this kind of whole and integrated view of life, primarily because of the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. That is, in the flesh, when Jesus was conceived as a child, born, lived a human life, he crossed over between the spiritual and the physical. His life here says that both realms are meaningful. Both realms are part of his kingdom. And that creates an integrated way to think about life that I haven't found available in any other worldview or religious tradition. I think that's pretty interesting. So we have conflict. We have this unrelated, but more peaceful approach to science and faith, and this complementary approach. So let me give some examples of voices who take a complementary approach to science and faith. And the two organizations I find most thoughtful about this, the first is BioLogos. There's their webpage. I would describe them as an advocacy organization answering questions about science and faith, and founded in 2007. Their mission statement sounds pretty familiar, at least in the terms of this class. BioLogos explores God's word and God's world. There's the two-book metaphor. Our vision is faith and science working hand in hand. That's a pretty clear statement of a complementary, harmonious relationship. The other group I'd like to introduce you to is called the American Scientific Affiliation, a group I'm a member of. That's their website. It's a professional society of Christians in the sciences and related fields. It was founded way back in 1941. And their statement, their mission statement, I think, is also descriptive. Where there is honest disagreement on an aspect of science, Christian faith, or the relationship between the two, the ASA strives to create a safe environment in which dialogue can flourish. So again, this is a professional society of people who are professionals in science, medicine, technology, a variety of different fields. And to promote dialogue and discussion, they publish a quarterly peer-reviewed journal called Perspectives on Science and Faith. And this is managed like other peer-reviewed scientific journals. They get independent peer review of articles that are submitted, and once they're approved, they're published in the journal. A lot of the articles, admittedly, are scholarly and academic in nature. So it is a scholarly journal. And among other voices, I want to be sure you're aware of Francis Collins. Now, Francis Collins was director of the Human Genome Project, which mapped the first map of the human genetic information. That was, as you see here, almost 15-year project. First of its kind in the world, a true breakthrough. Dr. Collins' background was in medicine. He had a specialty in genetics, and he was selected in '93 to lead this project, which came in on schedule and under budget. After he had substantially completed that project, he was invited to become the head of the National Institutes of Health, which is a government agency. It's the largest and the leading medical research organization in the entire world. Dr. Collins served in that role from 2009 to 2021. He served under 3 presidents. Now, back in 2006, he published a book, The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. I really recommend this book. It's really well written. It's clear and easy to read. It describes his own journey as a young doctor and an atheist to Christian belief. And it became, in its day, became a New York Times bestseller. Because of the response to this book, because of hundreds, even thousands of emails that Francis received asking questions, once they had read his book, Dr. Collins gathered a group of young scholars, and they began to sort through all these questions and write answers to them and post them online. And the answers to those frequently asked questions became the BioLogos website that I introduced to you on the previous slide. If you ever have a chance to hear him speak, he's an articulate and gentle soul. He's really a delightful person to listen to. Another voice in the complementary and harmonious camp is Dennis Lamoureux, whom I've already introduced to you, the professor at the University of Alberta. And I've also briefly referred to his book, Evolution, Scripture and Nature Say Yes, published in 2016. This too is an accessible and really well-written book, and it describes his own journey, not from atheism to faith, but he was a young earth creationist who in the year 2013 embraced evolutionary creation, which we'll also be talking about tonight. Well, if those are voices for a complementary, harmonious view of science and faith, there are also some loud voices of conflict. And for that, I'm going to start with John William Draper back in the 19th century, and he authored a book called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, published in 1875. Draper was an English-born, American-based scientist, pioneer in photography and the chemistry behind photography. In this book, he presents the history of science as a narrative of conflict, a story, if you will, of the conflict of 2 contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side, that's his positive description of science, an expansive force, and the compression arising from traditional faith and human interests on the other. That's his negative expression for faith. So, 2 contending powers. This book, according to several historians, is popularized what's known today as the conflict thesis, the broad assumption that faith and science are intrinsically in intellectual conflict, and that conflict inevitably leads to hostility. And that whole theme seems to start with the publication of Draper's book in 1875. Draper wasn't the only one. The conflict notion was further reinforced by Andrew Dixon White, who about 2 decades later, 1896, published his book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Now, obviously, you can see he's writing along the same theme of Draper. White was the co-founder and first president of Cornell University, 1865. And whereas White's book kind of White's book was very popular in the late 1800s, but Draper's book was very popular in the late 1800s, but kind of lost a following in the 20th century. But White's book remained a respected history of science into the mid-20th century, recommended by scholars, it seemed. White's book has lots of footnotes and big bibliography, so it seemed to be an impressive scholarly work. Well, that was the appearance. What happened was this conflict thesis got exposed, but it took until the 1970s before the work of Draper and White was, in fact, fully rejected by historians. Here's a few quotes from these modern day historians who took a careful and critical look at Draper and White's writings. Brooke in 1991 wrote that the conflict thesis has largely been discredited. Russell in 2000 wrote that Draper takes such liberty with history, perpetuating legends as fact, that he is rightly avoided today in serious historical study. The same is nearly as true of White. And Principi in 2006 joins the chorus. While we can look today with astonishment upon the shoddy character of Draper and White's writings, and he goes on from there. I might point out, I can give one solid example of the fraudulent history that Draper and White write about, and that is they both accuse the Catholic Church of being a flat earth society into the time of Columbus, 1492, and into the encounter with Galileo in the early 17th century. And historians are unanimous today in stating that was not true, that the Catholic Church was well aware of the prior work by the Greeks and by Islam about beliefs, understanding that the earth was spherical, and that the size of the earth had been estimated by people centuries before. The Catholic Church knew that, and they were aware of those things. So just one example of the kind of fraudulent history that finally exposed Draper and White. Time-wise, I think we're okay. Despite this change of point of view by historians, there continued to be voices for conflict. And here we are in the first decade of the 20th century. If you're not aware already, I think you should be aware of these 4 authors. Dennett in 2007, Hitchens also the same year, Dawkins 2008, Sam Harris back in 2004. These are 4 atheist authors. They all published books in this decade, all of which became bestsellers. They no longer advocated for conflict between faith and science. They just flat out argued that religion is bad, possibly a reaction to the 9/11 attacks back in 2001, and how that was rooted in Islamic fundamentalism. This was a decade of anti-religious sentiment, if you will. Okay, there's some voices from the secular side for science and faith conflict, but it's not limited to the secular side. There have been numerous voices on the Christian side, but surprisingly, from what I've seen, US Christians did not rise to the conflict idea until the early 20th century, really the decade of the 20s. And the classic example in the 1920s is the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, which we will discuss in some detail next week. So in time, the conflict between faith and science idea we began to hear voices from within the church, Christian believers rising to the challenge. But to be sure, the secular voices got a head start of several decades in the 19th century. Here's a more current example of this attitude from 2011, a prominent seminary president who wrote, "The debate over Darwinism rages on, with almost every week bringing a new salvo in the great controversy." I love that. It's got to get capital letters. The reason for this is simple and straightforward. Naturalistic evolution is the great intellectual rival to Christianity in the Western world. You know, this language is pretty similar to what Draper wrote in 1875, contending powers, intellectual powers. I'm going to talk more about evolution in topic 6 later in the evening. But for now, there's some examples of voices of conflict, both from the secular side and from the Christian side. It's an ongoing dialogue in our culture. So I am going to wrap up this topic, science and faith, 3 ways right here with this slide we've seen before. I think this is pretty descriptive from what I've read. This is how Americans think about science and faith. A strong majority view it as a source of conflict. According to the Gallup survey, about a third of Americans view it as conflict, about a third view it as being unrelated realms of life that don't have anything to do with each other. And only about 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 3, but 1 in 4 Americans land in this complementary category. To me, that's a little sobering that so few arrive at this point.
Hey, Jim,
Yes.
maybe if you could explore the word complementary a little, what does it mean and what does it not mean when in this particular context?
Of the survey or of this class, Doug?
Of your view on, keeping these 2 elements in holding them in a complementary manner. So if I've got, certain knowledge in science, what is it that I do with that knowledge, or what makes it complementary to my faith but still keeps it scientific? Or is there another realm that's sort of your top and bottom, or it's a top, middle, bottom, and in the middle world is or middle realm would be something that is informed by the both others and combined, and that's complementary? I don't know, that's still probably compartmentalized. I'm just trying to figure out how I take the execution and the facts of science, and put them in a complementary relationship with faith.
Okay. I guess the best I can say off the cuff is that the ideas I introduced in the first 4 weeks, I think, give us a foundation the two-book metaphor can give us a confidence that what we're discovering in science is God's creation. It's his handiwork. And hopefully that draws us to wonder and worship. And there's a complementary wholeness to it. That I think that's an important thing. And the other, of course, is that modern science is a legacy of Christianity, so that when we engage in science and work in that field, it has Christian roots. It's complementary to Christian thought. So those are the two big deals in my mind. And I hope it can lead us to viewing those parts of our thinking that might be otherwise separate, disjointed, unrelated to each other. I think they are related because all truth is God's truth. Does that help?
Yeah, so it's sort of in a meta science fashion that is where the relation would lie between faith and science, right? Because if we think about, like in the legacy example, it's the nature of God and the nature of God's creation that make it amenable to the presuppositions of science, that is regularity, reproducibility, and the like. I mean, one can study science and do all that without ascribing those characteristics as being sourced from God, but you can't do it without subscribing to those characteristics. So as Christians, we've got sort of a meta view on the science that we're doing, but we're able to execute science in the same sort of professional manner that someone else might. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. As I discussed briefly at the end of our fourth topic, that one need not be a Christian to do science. And scientists today may be completely unaware of the Christian thought that underlies or contributed to the birth of science. Yes, you're quite right. All right. Lots more perhaps we could open up there, but in view of the time, let me move to this. That was the fifth topic in my outline, and here's number 6.